I'm gonna see. Okay. Shall I start or shall you start, Ben? Do you have a preference?
You can start.
Okay.
I think it makes more sense for you to go first.
Yeah, just because of the writing system. All right. Is this sharing the correct thing? Does it say Mandarin Chinese? Excellent. Okay. So this is a presentation about Mandarin Chinese. So Mandarin Chinese is a language spoken by speakers, primarily in China. It's part of the Sino-Tibetan language family. It's derived from the Beijing dialect of China because it's the capital now, and has been for a little bit. Not actually terribly long. The country or the city where my grandfather came from, Nanjing, was the capital for a while, but Beijing won out, and so their language won out too. There's a little bit of a distinction between language and dialect that is unclear. So a lot of Chinese people will consider it different dialects of Chinese, but all one big language. But linguistically, it's often more considered a language family with a bunch of sublanguages because like they're very much not intelligible. Like a lot of different dialects have very different forms. And again, there's also some, I'm just gonna do a tiny preview of language before I start explaining things, because I'm going to be using like terminology of word, or I'll also be showing you how things are pronounced. So like word, what I normally think of it would be characters, but often it's more linguistically accurate to think of them as like potentially groups of characters often like really have more of a word meaning together, like the word for nose or teacher often will be multiple characters. And Pinyin is the method of writing Chinese down that I was brought up with, so that's the one that I'll use. It's the one used like by most people in China. In Taiwan, they'll often use different ways to show pronunciation. So here's some phonology. I'm just going to show you some graphs. So these are the different sounds that show up in Mandarin Chinese, the consonants. So as you'll notice, there's not really a difference between voiced and unvoiced for a lot of things. It's basically allophonic. For the unaspirated things, they can also sometimes be voiced. And I did not realize that that was the difference. To me, I thought it was just p and b were like, I thought p is just p and b, and the sounds that I heard in Chinese, the differences sounded the same to me. But actually, yeah, the difference is in aspiration, not in voicing. But yeah, you can see that it's like a pretty, like there's not a lot of holes in this. And a lot of these are also allophones as well, but I'll talk about that later. So here's some of the vowels. So the different I, U, Yu, and then like or and then and they have like a decent amount of range in what they can be pronounced as. It like sort of, it mostly depends on like the context of what consonants are around it. For example, like the pronunciation of the u, really I can think of like basically only when it has like a most syllables correspond to characters in Chinese, and the characters or like syllables have like individual morphemes, like and when they end in like a sound at the end, so it will be like n or n, then it's more likely to have that sound. And I've been sort of like stumbling over myself because like this is sort of a way that sort of gives an idea of how people normally think of how sounds work. So This is the Bupamuffa de Tanilla. This is more commonly used in Taiwan. And the little characters to the side sort of are just representations of these sounds. They're not actual words. So the green things are things that can start a word. The blue are the sounds that end a word. Occasionally there's like E and U and U that can be glides. So, but for the most part, if you take a green and take a blue, that will form a word. So as you can see, there's not a lot of things. It's rare for it to be, if you want to have like gek or like jeb or any, definitely like no sounds like that. It's mostly just one consonant, one vowel with a little bit of asterisk. One of the things that's most famous about Chinese is its tone system. Mandarin has 4 tones plus a sort of neutral tone. These are called contour tones. That means it's based on where the pitch is varying, not necessarily what the pitch is absolutely. Like in like is more common in, say, African languages. Some of them have tones, and a lot of them will be more likely to have a pitch tone where it's based on like how high or low you're saying it. Contour tone is like the shape of the pitch. So I guess I'll demonstrate. This first word is mother, and it's pronounced ma. The second word is ma. So that's the first one was the stable pitch, second one's rising pitch. Third one is ma, and that actually combines both, like it's sort of like a low pitch, steadily low, often, can I annotate? Yeah. As you can see, like they have that little shape like this. That's basically saying, often it's like ma is often how you, if you're trying to do it really carefully, but often it's just low. And that one is special in that it's actually always goes along with a creaky voice as well, which basically like, hello, my name is Joanna sort of voice. And then last one, falling pitch, ma. This is the word for scold. And then there's also ma, which there isn't really tone, and it's sort of also not really, pretty much never stressed. When it's not stressed, it's more likely to be closer to, it's like less toned. And there's also something called tone sandi. So sandi is a phrase that's used like in language in general, because it's not a Chinese word. Basically it's like connections. It's from like Sanskrit, I think. But basically tones will change based on things that are next to it. So Chinese really doesn't like having 2 third tones, so that's the ma sort of tone next to each other. So if there's 2 next to each other, it'll normally go up and then do the third tone. There's also some specific words like E, which means 1, that will turn to second tone E very often when it's doing falling down next, for example. And the word for not, bu, actually goes up instead quite often as well, when you would go down afterwards. So there is not really any morphology, as it were, in Chinese. Like the different morphemes sort of go next to each other, and there's not really any endings exactly, or prefixes, really. Sort of prefixes, if in some cases, but not really. If you think of it as individual characters, individual syllables, there's basically not, morphology doesn't really make sense as a concept. Word order is subject, object, verb, and it's head final, which means when you have descriptors, the thing that it's describing goes after at the end. So that in itself is like superficially pretty, did I write SOV? That was supposed to be SVO. That's an awkward typo. Yeah, so SVO, let me annotate that so that it's very obvious that that is wrong. That should be SVO. It is subject, verb, object, quite like English. But superficially is not the same as in reality. In reality, syntax is rather different. So there's not really a distinction in, numbers. So you can often tell that either from context or a few words, like pronouns, personal pronouns, so the word 我 means I, but the word 我们 means we. Or 他 means he or she or it or they or any of those. And then 他们 means they, plural. Ni means you and 你们 means you, plural. But you can't use 们 for things that aren't personal pronouns really, except for a few exceptions. And there's also some example, you can also do things like 些, which means some. 些 can be used in a few things too. But for the most part, there's no number. And also there's not really a sense of tense that much, but you can argue that there is, and there definitely is some sort of aspect. So le gives sort of a perfective aspect, which means things have been, the thing that is being talked about has been completed or sort of will be completed or something like that. It has a sense of completion. And that is a particle that's used very frequently. There's also 正在, which is an imperfective aspect marker that also is optional, and even more optional than the le. If there's a lot of sentences where if you don't say the le, it sounds really weird. But if you don't include 正在, then it's like pretty normal. 正在is not like a specific. There's other phrases that you can use. It just means like right now. And you can use that, and that sort of means it hasn't been completed. There's also reduplication, which can sort of give aspectees. Oh boy, my phone's dying, but I don't need it, so it's okay. Aspect that reduplication can often have an idea of like things that are like being done in a small amount. So 走 basically like that means walk. So if you're going to say I'm going to take a little walk in the park or something, then you might say 走 which means walk, but that sort of gives the idea that you're only walking a little bit. Possession and many other things are marked with de. So whenever you say something like my dog, you'd say 我的狗. So the 我的 means the 我 is I, and then de is possession, and then 狗 would mean dog. But it's also used for things like anything that's describing like relative clauses are going to be with de. So whenever you're saying something like the dog that I carried, and then the that I carried sort of thing goes in front. So that's like a head, that has to do with it being head final. It's just a lot more than in English, where we put the adjectives first, but relative clauses happen afterward. Instead of various little conjunctions and prepositions and stuff, a lot of the time there are words that are sort of verbs, but you can use to do things that are grammatically sort of similar to prepositions. So for example, the word bang means help, but if you're saying like, I'm going to help you cook dinner, actually that's a bad example. Like if you're saying I'm making dinner, no, I am like working on this project for you, then you might say bang for the for you part. But yeah, it really means, you can sort of just translate it as helping you, but then there's just like often like serial verbs, so verbs like all next to each other that sort of get the idea across. There's a lot of there's not that many sentence final particles, but they're used quite frequently. So le, a lot of sentences will end with la, and that is sort of related to the le that can happen in the after the verb. So that that have the like perfective sense or other things sort of similar to that. Le is sort of declarative sort of ending. You don't need to have all of your sentences end with that for sure. And it is definitely has a perfective sort of sense. Ma, the second one, the one that I'm not sure you remember from before, but I'll go into this later, but the ma means is the question marker, and you might recognize the second part of that character from our ma earlier, where we had a lot of things that had that little symbol. Is sort of like, it's hard to describe what they all mean, but basically there's a lot of them, and they can be like, you know, I'm giving you a friendly warning is one of them. It's, oh, I didn't write that one down here. But I would say these are some of the more common endings. And I mentioned reduplication earlier. It's a very, very common thing in Mandarin. So some examples here are go go. So the word for dog, go. If you say it twice, then it's like doggy or like puppy. So if you're like a little kid going around China and you see a dog, then you're going to say go go. You're not going to say go. That's too mature. And there's also like words. The word for happy is gao xing. Those, as you can see, it turned into gao gao xing xing. So you can say it like that. It basically means like happy, very happy. Also, in my mind, it's often, it won't really be used like as a normal adjective. It's more sort of like adverbial, or like if it's like sort of like you know, in the sentence where I am very happy, it's like a positive, more like. So one thing that's pretty unique to languages around this area are classifiers. So there isn't really a word for or the, and instead, when you're talking about like something, you'll often say yi, which means yiga. So the yi, that word means one, and then you'll have one of these counting words. So ge is by far the most common, most commonly used one. If someone had like fully fancy Chinese, they would use a lot more. They would like, there might be enough other counting words that it's not like as commonly used, but whenever you're speaking, you can almost always substitute ge for all of these. And that's what I'll do because I don't really know all the counting words. I guess I'm going to explain the title at the beginning. So it says classifiers, that's what they're called. So you can use it for like saying things like just like one, or also if it's like measure words, so quantity. For me, that doesn't seem like a very big difference. But in some sense, like, for example, the word ko, it's the word that means mouth. But if you're talking about like a mouthful of rice and you say ko would be the mouthful part. And you wouldn't say of either, right? It would just be, yeah. And then family members, like, I think, you know, like you have mouths to feed. So when you talk about family members, you also use mo, ko. And that would be sort of the difference in the like counting words and like measure words. But in Chinese, there is not really, you don't really think about the difference. So they often use them for like different, like the semantic meaning of the word that follows. So words like ba. So anything that has a handle, you'll often use that because it's a word that means grip. Or gun, it's a measure word that you use for like narrow things like needles. I found out today that the word p, which I think of it as being p because you always have the word ma after it, and what I thought ma means horse. So it is ep ma, you would say a horse. But it also apparently is the classifier for rolls of cloth. So that's fun. Zhang is for flat objects. It's also fairly common. So when you're talking about paper or tables, you'll often use that. And then xie, I mentioned that earlier. It's the word for some, and you'll use that when you're talking about like a few blah. And that's also like ge, a more common generic sort of classifier. And so now I want to talk about the writing system. So Ben's going to talk about the Japanese writing system later, and that will have some commonalities. So he'll talk to you about how, in what way they're similar and stuff. So I will stop. I won't do that now. But so Chinese, all the little morphemes, the smallest morphemes are characters, and everything you just write down the single morphemes, the characters, and those are what I would call words, but other people would call like morphemes. So in 100 CE, some guy called Shi Shen wrote a book that described a lot about words, and one of the things he did was he classified characters into 6 types. So there's a lot of the beginning ones are pictograms. So not a lot of unique words are in that category, but a lot of like basic physical things are going to be pictograms. So they will show up more frequently compared to their like that apparently they're 4% of characters or something, but they will show up more than that. So like zhi means sun. So this is basically, it was drawn like this, the sun, for some reason. And then it sort of turned into this. And then yeah is the word for moon. And that's the like the idea of this. And then there's like clouds drifting past is how I was described when I was little. I'm not sure whether that's real, but that's how they drew it originally, potentially. And then it turned into this. Then there's ideograms. So shang, that would be like a line with a dot over it. So it's like up, that means above or on, or yeah. And then xia would be down or below. And that came from this drawing. And then there's also things like associative idea characters, which is, these all have their own words in Chinese. Of course, this guy didn't write this all. He wasn't talking about pictograms in English, in like the English word. He had his own word for it. So associative idea characters, these are apparently more common in characters like the Chinese themed characters that are invented in Japan. But they still show up a little bit in Chinese. So things like Ming, which means bright. It's also used in words like remember. So the word for remember is Ming Bai. So bright, white. But Ming, as you can see from earlier, oh look, that's this, and that's this. So that the sun and the moon are bright. And so that's why the word Ming Bai, or the word Ming, comes from that. And then hao means good. And those are the words for basically woman and sun. So zi, it's also a pretty common word that doesn't really normally use means sun anymore. It means, it's just like an ending that you use for a lot of things. A lot of Chinese words don't like being monosyllables in some cases. And so like you'll often tack a zi at the end. Like shizi means lion. The shi by itself can mean lion, but you basically, like, no one will just say shi. You just always include the zi. Yeah, and so they thought a woman with her child was good, and so that's the word for good. And there's things, the following thing, rebus, is something that people talk about a lot when they're talking about the transfer from word logograms, so like words, like characters for individual words, turning into like how English is without like it being more based on sound. So things like 字, that's the word that means self, but originally that character was the word for nose, and then the word for self also was pronounced that way, and so they wrote it down that way as well. And then the word for scorpion apparently was something that looked like this, and the word for 10,000, I think, was pronounced the same way, and so they wrote it down the same way. And I have like in parentheses one, that's this so far I've been doing things in simplified Chinese characters instead of traditional. I guess I'll talk about that later. But that first character, the one that originally meant scorpion, was in traditional. And so I wanted to include that, but also since I've been doing everything in simplified, I wanted to include the simplified. And then most words are phonosemitic compounds. So there's things called radicals, which will go around the word mostly. So normally on the side or the bottom, especially on the left or on the bottom, I think I'd say, especially the left. It will give sort of a semantic meaning. And then the little bit on the right or whatever next to it it will give the idea of how it's pronounced. So I'm gonna quickly zip back to the ma slide. So it's not true for the word ma, which is apparently the word for hemp, but black sesame, for example, 芝麻, or I guess that's sesame in general, uses that word. So ma and ma and ma and ma all have this little character. This, if I'm gonna annotate again, that word came from the traditional character for horse was this, and then they sort of transformed it into this. And hypothetically speaking, you can sort of see a horse in that first picture. Those are sort of like 4 legs, question mark. So that's the word for horse. That would have been the pictogram. And then all these other things. So this means female, it's off to the side. And then this part means horse. But that's not actually in the meaning of mother. You're not calling your mother a horse or anything like that. It's just because the word for mother sounds like the word for horse. So they take the little symbol that means horse, and then they add the little female radical to the side. When you talk about the radicals in Chinese, you say the word for the radical. So this comes from a Chinese word meaning woman. And then you say zi, which is that word that I mentioned meant son before. But you just use it, it's just used that a lot. And then pang, I don't know how to write pang, and that means radical. So I was trying to say nizi pang, but that wouldn't have been clear to what you guys, about what that meant. And then this word means mouth when it's on its own. And you put 2 on top, it means scold. And then this also means mouth, but you put on the side this time, there's only one of them. And it's often what you do for like interjections or things at the end of sentences. So as you can see, that's what the phonosemantic thing is. So it has elements of the sound and elements of the meaning. And then there's transform cognates. It's not a really big category, but he included it, so I'm gonna include it. Basically, there's words that potentially were written the same way, words that were written the same way and potentially used to mean the same thing, and then slightly changed their spelling or like their writing, but and extremely changed the pronunciation and meaning, or slightly changed pronunciation and their meaning, and that'd be the transform cognates. So here's an example of radicals more generally. So this, let me clear so it's not gross. So this is the word for the character, the radical for grass. So this is not a character on its own. Oftentimes, words that that are words on their own get turned into radicals, but they often get changed quite a lot. Sometimes they're similar. So for example, this is one of the ways that when water is written off to the side, then it's written like this. But the word for water is something like this. But the way that they thought it would look good squished was like these three little dots like this. And the word for grass also has been changed extremely to get to this point. However, words like fire, this is just the word for fire. And so the huo zipang, huo means fire, zipang means is the way to make the radical name, is just basically a squished version of the word for fire. These radicals will often be different depending on what position they're in. So I'm slightly panicking at an example right now, but I think this is also the water character. So sorry, radicals, but it's at the bottom. And this is what it looks like what's on the side. Sometimes they go around. As you can see, there's that little, this thing written on top, and it looks different depending on where it is. One example of, so this zhen, this means person. And then when you put it off to the side, it looks like this. So here's some comparison. One thing you'll see here is like, you might notice a very specific way of writing. So in Chinese, there's a very specific order that you write the strokes. And you basically have to memorize it, although, like, for example, if you're doing something like, so ko, then you'll write like this. You write that one first, and then you write that, and then you write that. And that is like very specific for Chinese writing. It's almost like spelling it wrong if you do it in the wrong order. You can't really see it, but it's like, for some reason, pretty important. And one of the reasons why it's important, like when there's often different, like the word huo. That's the word for fire, and it's also like part of a word for like guy. And that's with the same tone. Like words, including like with tone and everything, often have a lot of different words that are like written completely different ways. So whenever, like if you're introducing yourself, if I'm saying my name is Tang Shou Wang, which is my name, then you'll sometimes like write it. So like you'll either say something like, you'll either scribble it and you can sort of see what you're writing. And that's a reason why we're like order might be relevant. Also, you'll say something like bao shou de shou. So that's the shou, that's the middle word. So bao shou means protect. So then like you would give an example of a like word / phrase that includes the character that the word that you're trying to describe is. And then de means like, it's like apostrophe s, the possessive thing that I mentioned earlier. And that's how you'll explain the differences between things. So here, everything is, so as I mentioned earlier, there's different, there's the traditional and the simplified characters. I wish I decided that realized I was going to talk about it, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I don't have a slide for it, but basically there's two kinds of characters. So there's simplified and traditional. So traditional was the way of writing for a long time. Basically, for a very, very long time, they wrote characters all the same way. But very recently, like when the Chinese government changed, there was the writing system was simplified. I mostly did things in traditional writing, but simplified writing is what they do in mainland China right now. Traditional is what they do in Taiwan. Basically, they're just doing it to be different. And like not the Taiwan, the pairs of people are doing it. The pairs of groups of people are doing it to be different. There's no particular reason to use one or the other. One interesting thing is the radicals even can be different depending on like whether you're doing simplified or traditional. And as you saw earlier, like for example, this word, it does not at all look similar when you compare like the traditional versus the simplified. And so like sometimes they just make it, because like the word for 10,000 is a pretty important word. So you know, you gotta have a different symbol for it and not make it like ridiculously long. And so yeah, I think Ben's going to talk a little bit about how these characters are used in Japanese, and then also about the Japanese language in general. So I will leave now to give him some time for that.
Okay, let me see. Does that work? I mean, is that visible?
Yeah.
Ben, why
Okay.
is it oval?
Because I was lazy and I just took a random picture of the Japanese flag off the internet. I didn't readjust the size. It looks kind of cool. I don't know. Anyway, Japanese. I'm not a native Japanese speaker. I'm in my second semester of Japanese class, so I'm nowhere near fluent, but I do think I know enough basic information to give this presentation. Okay, so general information. Japanese has 126 million speakers worldwide. I think it was around the 13th or 14th most popular language by speakers. I don't remember exactly. In terms of language family, it's Japonic. There are some theories about other language families to which it might be related. For example, Sino-Tibetan or other things like that. But none of those theories are very concrete at the moment. So the majority opinion is that it's a language isolate. It's not connected to any other language family, or at least we can't prove that it is. In terms of phonology, Japanese has very few morphemes comparatively. 15 consonant morphemes, phonemes. 15 consonant phonemes and 5 core vowels, which as we'll see, leads to a relatively small amount of possible syllables, because Japanese is a syllabary. And so that in turn leads to a lot of homophones. Unlike Chinese, which has a contour pitch, Japanese does have a pitch accent. That means it has high pitch and low pitch. And this is important for meaning. Two words with the same spelling but different pitch to mean different things. The classic example is hashi versus hashi. Hashi high-low is chopstick, hashi, low-high is bridge. And then Japanese is a subject-object-verb language, and that is not a typo. So the writing system is well spent. I'm not going to get through all of this, so I'll focus on the writing system. Japanese has kanji, which literally just means Chinese characters, and that's the main connection that Japanese shares with Chinese. A lot of that is what Joanna just talked about. So it'll be pretty familiar. The thing that's unique to Japanese is the kana. Kana means fake name, and this is the syllabary part. There are two types of kana, hiragana and katakana, and I'll go over those. And then finally, there's the romanization system, romaji. There are multiple types of romanization, but I'll just use the most standard one. I won't talk about it that much. Okay, so hiragana and katakana. Hiragana is used for native Japanese words. This includes just words that are actually Japanese words rather than loan words. They're also used for okurigana, which are grammatical endings on words, and furigana, which are reading aids to help people know how to pronounce kanji. It's especially used for children and young adult literature, and in writing in general for kanji that are obscure. Whereas katakana has a wider variety of uses. It's used for loanwords. For example, the word arbeito is from the German word Arbeit, which means work, and arbeito means part-time job, and that's written in katakana. It's used for emphasis, onomatopoeias, robotic speech. As you'll see soon, katakana is a very angular script, so I'm guessing that's why, and other uses I didn't mention. And just like the Rabius principle was mentioned, Joanna mentioned it about Chinese, it's used here as well. That principle is how kanji developed into kana. At some point, the kanji started being used for their sound instead of for their meaning, and that's how the syllabary developed. And then the kana became gradually simplified versions of the kanji. A classic example of the Rabius principle, by the way, is writing the English word belief using a picture of a bee and then a picture of a leaf. That's the type of thing it is. Using the sound of a pictogram rather than meaning. Okay, so hiragana. This is how it's typically organized. On the right side here, there are 5 vowels, a, I, u, e, o. And then on the top, there's a variety of different consonants. And the way it works is that each syllable, the majority of syllables besides the vowel and this N here on the top left side are a consonant followed by a vowel. So ka, ki, ku, ke, ko, sa, shi, su, se, so, ta, chi, tsu, te, to, na, ni, nu, ne, no, etc. And in this picture is included the stroke order to write all of them. There are some notable special cases here that I circled very messily, so I'll go through them. The first is she. You'd expect it to be C, but it's actually just she. Likewise, you'd expect chi to be T, but it's chi, and it's tsu rather than tu. In Japanese, the H sound is kind of like an F sound, but shu in particular is transcribed with an F, romanized with an F rather than H usually. And then N, as an exception, it's just neither a vowel nor a consonant followed by a vowel. And then we, we, and wo are obsolete kana. They're not used anymore with one exception, which is that wo has a grammatical use, but it's pronounced as o rather than wo. I'm probably not going to get to that, but it is used, but otherwise it's obsolete. So there are a variety of ways to get different sounds using the hiragana system. So first is long vowels. So if you have a like ka followed by a, that means k and then a long a. In Japanese, long vowels are held for twice the length of a short vowel. So ka, ki, ku, the last two there, k and ko, they sound just like you'd expect it, but the way they're written is a little strange. Instead of writing K-E-E, you write K-E-I. Instead of writing K-O-O, you write K-O-U. So it's a little irregular in the writing, but in pronunciation-wise, it's the same. And this is important for meaning. Koko is different from koko. Koko is here, koko is high school. And then there are more dangerous mistakes to make, like obasan versus obasan. Obasan is lady, obasan is old lady. And my favorite is shujin is husband, whereas shujin is prisoner. So that's an important distinction to make, and it shows how these small differences are important for meaning. Likewise, there's consonant gemination, which is small, uses small tsu character called sokulon. And this is pronounced with a glottal stop. So sakka is author. I don't have a funny example here, but it is important for meaning still. Kita and kita are different verbs. Another way to modify hiragana is to use diacritics. Dakuten and handakuten. The dakuten are those two lines, the top right, of the kana character, of the hiragana characters, and those create voiced versions of the unvoiced characters. For example, the right column is the K column originally, with dakuten added becomes the G column. The top row is the K row, but with dakuten added becomes the G row, and then S becomes Z, T becomes D, and H becomes B. And there's also handakuten in the bottom row, that circle symbol. It's also called the half voice symbol. It's only used with the H characters, and it turns the H sounds into P sounds. So we have ha, pi, hu, pe, po. And finally, there are glides. If you use the characters that have E as a vowel, and then you add ya, you, or yo, a small ya, you, or yo, that creates a glide. So reading these off, we have kya, q, kyo, sha, shu, sho, sha, chu, cho, nya, nyu, nyo, hya, hyu, hyo, etc. I'm going through this kind of fast, but it would take a long time to memorize it anyway, so I think it's fine. So everything I said about Hiragana applies to Katakana as well. So I'm just going to skip over most of it. But as you can see here, Katakana works the exact same way. 5 vowels, and it's paired with all the other consonants in the same syllabic way, along with this N character here. And likewise, we, we, and lo are obsolete. All the same things apply, like long vowels, glides, consonant gemination. But katakana has the distinction of being adapted to write phonemes that are not found in Japanese, which is important for loanwords. For example, you can't do this normally. With katakana, you can use a small e character to create glides with e, so changey is possible. Otherwise, if you want an F sound as opposed to an H sound, that's possible by adding a small vowel after the H character. So family for family. And then as one more example, you can have V sounds by having a strange usage of dakuten and adding it onto the U sound. The U vowel followed by a small vowel. So that's Victa there. This is a strange example because normally Japanese would use V to write V. So it would be Victa as the more common version, but it's possible either way. And as a side note, one difference between katakana and hiragana is that instead of using a vowel, an additional vowel to signify a long vowel, katakana just uses a dash. So for example, rumeito in katakana is roommate. Let's see. There's not much time left, so I'll just do this quickly. So this is very similar to what Joanna mentioned for Chinese characters because they are the same, or a developed form. 2,136 kanji are considered necessary for literacy, though many more exist. And Japanese speakers in general understand more than that. There was an orthographic reform in 1946 after World War II that simplified the kanji system and specified which kanji would be learned at which grade level. So it just standardized things in general and led to the kanji that we see today. But kanji reform has been happening as recently as 2017, I think. But in general, unlike in Chinese, the kanji aren't the only things Japanese has. It also has kana, and combinations of kana and kanji form words. Because these are originally Chinese characters, kanji in Japanese have onyomi and kunyomi. Onyomi are the Chinese pronunciations of the character, and kunyomi are the Japanese pronunciations. onyomi are the Japanese approximations of the Chinese character at the time when it was borrowed, whereas kunyomi is a native Japanese word that means the same thing or very similar thing to the Chinese character. So in this way, kanji has developed a lot of different pronunciations, and I've showed that below. It's something that has to be learned. So the character on the left is he, son, or day, whereas in the word kayobi, it's not pronounced he anymore, but as b, which looks kind of similar. Kayobi is Tuesday, by the way, the day of fire. Whereas in Kutsukayo, the same kanji is pronounced as ka, and in Konichi, the same kanji is pronounced as nichi. So there are some rules that govern when you use the onyomi and when you use the kunyomi, but in general, it just has to be memorized. And the way you tend to do it, at least in my experience, is to learn new vocabulary in kana first and later learn which kanji are used to write that word. And like I mentioned earlier, the few numbers, the low number of phonemes in Japanese leads to a lot of homophones. Some good examples are she and she. They're both pronounced the same. One means death and one means for. And then ku and ku, one means 9 and one means suffering. And I chose this example because it explains how 4 and 9 are considered unlucky numbers in Japan. I think I should maybe stop here. I don't have that much more anyway. It's just these 3 slides. I'll just say that nouns in Japanese aren't inflected. There's no number, no grammatical gender or anything. Instead, particles are used and attached to the end of the nouns as a case system. And verbs are inflected for tense, voice, mood, and politeness. Politeness is an important topic in Japanese. And Japanese verbs are usually very regular, with the exception of a few verbs. There are 2 very common irregular verbs, but I think 12 in total in the whole language. And these are some examples of inflecting verbs. I won't go over it, but it makes a lot of sense once you get used to it. And that's all I have to say. So I guess I can answer questions if anyone has any. But otherwise, I'm done.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. That was interesting to see. I was always confused about how they could use a character that is pronounced completely differently.
Yeah, it's definitely confusing. I still don't understand it myself. But yeah, I think it's interesting to look at the characters in Chinese and then how they developed in their own uses in Japanese.
Yeah, thank you both so much. That was really cool.